Imagine a dungeon somewhere in medieval Spain, stone walls sweating with moisture, chains so heavy they have worn grooves into the prisoner's wrists. Outside these walls, the world continues, markets open, children play, the sun rises and sets, but here, time has stopped. Here, there is only darkness and the slow erosion of hope. The prisoner has prayed. For weeks, perhaps months, he has prayed. But the prayers seem to dissolve against these walls like breath against winter air. Sleep has become his only refuge, the only hours when the weight of the chains does not press upon his soul. And then, in the deepest hour of the night, something changes. Light fills the cell, not the harsh light of torches, but something softer, something that seems to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. A figure stands before him, an abbot in Benedictine robes, his face radiating a peace the prisoner has forgotten existed. Before a word can be spoken, the chains fall from his wrists. They do not unlock, they simply fall, as though they had never been fastened at all. The abbot extends his hand. Follow me. This scene repeated itself across Spain for generations after the death of Dominic of Silos in 1073. And those who were freed came to his tomb, carrying their broken chains as proof. The miracles attributed to Dominic of Silos are not the stuff of legend passed down through centuries of embellishment. They were documented systematically, beginning shortly after the saint's death, by the monks of the monastery of Silos. The Libro de los Milagros de Santo, Domingo de Silos, represents something remarkable for its era, an institutional effort to record, verify, and preserve testimonies of miraculous events. The monks did not simply transcribe stories they heard at the monastery gates. According to the historical record, they interrogated those who claimed liberation. They documented details where the prisoner had been held, how long, under what circumstances. They collected physical evidence. The broken chains became central to this documentation. Prisoners freed through Dominic's intercession brought their chains to Silos as votive offerings and as tangible proof of their escape. By the 13th century, when the poet Gonzalo de Berceo composed his Vida de Santo Domingo de Silos, these chains had accumulated in such numbers that they filled the monastery church. Some of these chains survive to this day at Silos, archaeological remnants of a devotional phenomenon that spanned centuries. The Bollandists, those meticulous Jesuit scholars who compiled the Acta Sanctorum, examined these accounts with their characteristic rigor. What they found compelling was the consistency. Prisoners from different regions, different years, different circumstances, people who had no connection to one another, all described remarkably similar experiences. The testimonies and the chains that accompanied them gave these miracles a documentary weight unusual for their era. To understand why Dominic would spend eternity liberating prisoners, one must understand who he was during his earthly life. He was born around the year 1000s in Cañas, a small village in the Kingdom of Navarre. The sources describe a young man drawn to the contemplative life, entering the Benedictine monastery of San Millán de la Cogolla, and eventually rising to the position of prior. It was there that Dominic first demonstrated the quality that would define both his life and his posthumous ministry, an uncompromising fidelity to what he believed was right, regardless of the cost. When King Garcia III of Navarre demanded that the monastery surrender its treasures to fund his military campaigns, Dominic refused. The king exiled him. This exile, which must have seemed like catastrophe, became providence. King Ferdinand I of Castile welcomed the displaced monk and entrusted him with the monastery of Silos, a community in ruins. Few monks remained. The buildings crumbled. The spiritual life of the place had all but dissolved. Over the following decades, Dominic rebuilt everything. He restored the physical structures stone by stone. He revitalized the monastic community, attracting new vocations. He established Silos as a center of learning and manuscript production, one of the great scriptoriums of medieval Spain. Under his leadership, the monastery became a beacon of spiritual and intellectual life. But the sources emphasize that Dominic was far more than an administrator. He was a man of profound prayer, of tender compassion for those who suffered, and he had a particular concern for those held in captivity. In the contested borderlands of Reconquista Spain, where Christian and Moorish kingdoms clashed and overlapped, capture was a constant danger. Dominic worked actively for the ransom of Christian prisoners held in Moorish territories. His concern for the imprisoned was not abstract theology. It was active ministry, practical charity, personal engagement with the suffering of captives. When he died on December 20, 1073, that ministry did not end. According to the testimonies that would accumulate at Silos in the years and decades that followed, it intensified beyond anything earthly efforts could have achieved. The Libro de los Milagros preserves accounts of liberation that share a remarkable consistency despite their diversity of circumstance. The prisoners came from every station of life. Soldiers captured in battle against Moorish forces, merchants seized by pirates along the coast, peasants thrown into dungeons by cruel lords, men imprisoned for debts they could not pay, men accused falsely, condemned unjustly, abandoned by everyone who might have advocated for their release. They had one thing in common. They had no natural hope of escape. And then Dominic came to them. According to the testimonies, he appeared at night, when the prisoners slept or lay awake in the darkness of their despair. He came in his Benedictine habit, often surrounded by or emanating light, a soft radiance that filled the cell without waking the guards. He spoke words of comfort, and then, impossibly, the chains binding the prisoner would shatter or fall away. Some accounts describe prisoners being led physically out of their dungeons. Locked doors opened at the saint's approach. Guards slept on, undisturbed, as captives walked past them into freedom. Some prisoners reported finding themselves outside prison walls, sometimes miles away, with no natural explanation for how they had traveled. Others described Dominic breaking their chains and then instructing them on how to flee, showing them passages, telling them which guards would be absent, providing the knowledge necessary for escape even as his visible presence faded. The testimonies record fellow prisoners and guards waking to the sound of chains shattering, witnesses who saw the aftermath even if they did not see the saint himself. Some accounts describe multiple prisoners being freed in a single night, each reporting the same visitor. What struck those who collected these testimonies was how the accounts corroborated one another. People who had never met, who came from different regions of Spain, who had been held by different captors in different years, all described the same figure, the same peaceful authority, the same Benedictine robes, the same miraculous liberation, and they came to Silos. From across the Iberian Peninsula, the freed prisoners made pilgrimage to the monastery. They carried the chains that had bound them, chains that bore no marks of tools, no evidence of how they had been broken. They testified before the monks, describing what had happened in the darkness of their cells. They gave thanks at Dominic's tomb. They hung their chains in the church as evidence and as offering. The devotion spread organically across Spain. Parents began naming their sons Domingo in hope of the saint's protection. Prisoners who had not yet been freed began invoking his intercession. The monastery of Silos became a pilgrimage site, not only for the devout, but for the desperate, those whose loved ones languished in captivity, those who feared imprisonment themselves, those who had heard the stories and believed. The chains continued to accumulate. Decade after decade, century after century, the freed came to give thanks and leave their proof behind. What do these posthumous miracles reveal about the communion of saints? The Church has always taught that death does not sever the bonds between those in heaven and those still struggling on earth. The saints can intercede for the living. Their prayers before the throne of God carry the weight of their perfected charity. But the miracles of Dominic of Silos demonstrate this doctrine with vivid particularity. Here was a man who cared for prisoners during his earthly life, who worked for their ransom, who grieved over their suffering, who made their liberation part of his ministry. And that ministry did not end when his body was laid in the tomb at Silos. It intensified. It was elevated. Through God's grace, the compassion Dominic had cultivated during his life became an ongoing charism, a continuing ministry that transcended the limitations of earthly existence. There is scriptural resonance in these liberations. The Acts of the Apostles records angels opening prison doors for Peter and Paul. Christ himself proclaimed liberty to captives as central to his mission. Among the works of mercy that will be weighed at the final judgment, visiting the imprisoned stands alongside feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. The imprisoned have always held a special place in Christian consciousness. Dominic's posthumous ministry suggests that the saints in heaven remain who they were on earth, but freed from every limitation. empowered by their union with God to accomplish what earthly charity could only attempt. The abbot who had worked for prisoners' ransom now appeared in their cells to ransom them himself. The chains hanging in the church at Silos were more than proof of miracles. They were testimony to a communion between heaven and earth that continues even now. They witnessed to saints who remain active in the lives of the suffering, to a God who hears the cry of the imprisoned, to a compassion that death cannot diminish. Not all prisons are made of stone. Many souls find themselves bound by chains, invisible but no less real. Addiction that tightens its grip with every passing day. Despair that locks the door against hope. Circumstances that seem to offer no escape, no possibility of freedom. The miracles of Dominic of Silos offer a quiet testimony. Heaven sees those who are bound. Divine compassion reaches into the darkest dungeons, the most forgotten cells. Chains that seem unbreakable can be shattered by grace. The saint who spent eternity setting prisoners free still intercedes for those who invoke him. Perhaps, in the darkness of whatever captivity weighs upon your soul tonight, a gentle light might fill the cell. Perhaps chains might fall that you had ceased to believe could ever be broken. Perhaps freedom is closer than despair allows you to imagine.